I was just building a table, until she pulled me onto it, and everything changed. I never thought a simple Saturday morning could feel like the beginning of something I didn't know I was waiting for. The text came unexpectedly. "Could you help me with some furniture at my place?" "A casual favor," she said. But there was something in the way she phrased it that made me pause. She wasn't just anyone. She was the woman from down the street, early 40s, effortlessly graceful. Someone who seemed to move through the world with quiet confidence. There was a calm in her presence that made ordinary moments feel slower, richer, like time had softened just enough for you to notice the little things. When I arrived, the sunlight was streaming through her living room windows, dust motes drifting lazily in the warm rays. The room smelled faintly of fresh paint and something floral, maybe her perfume. She was kneeling by a stack of wooden boards, checking measurements, her hair falling just so over her shoulder. She glanced up and our eyes met. Something in that look was fleeting but meaningful, like an unspoken greeting that said, "I've been expecting you." I tried to focus on the task at hand, on the table that needed building, but the moment her hand brushed mine as she handed me a measuring tape, I felt it, a warmth that seemed to linger long after contact. It was subtle, the kind of touch that leaves you noticing a sensation you can't quite name, your fingers tingling where hers had passed. I caught myself looking at the way she moved, the gentle precision in her actions, the curve of her smile when she noticed me hesitating over a misaligned board. We began working together side by side. I drilled, she held the plank steady. The rhythm of our movements synced almost instinctively. Sawdust clung to our hands, and I could smell the mix of wood and her subtle scent every time we leaned close to check measurements. I kept noticing the way she'd tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the soft brush of her sleeve against my arm, and the faint tremor in her laugh when a board wobbled. There was a confidence in her that I couldn't ignore, but it wasn't the kind that demanded attention. It was quiet, magnetic, like sunlight warming the room in a way that makes everything else fade into the background. I was aware of the age gap, of course, her calm steadiness against my nervous energy, but it only made me more aware of how drawn I was to her presence, how easy it was to fall into conversation, how comfortable I felt sharing small jokes or asking questions I might normally hesitate to voice. By the time we paused for a brief water break, I realized that something about this morning felt different. It wasn't just about building a table anymore. It was the way the air felt between us, charged yet gentle, like it was waiting for something unspoken. And in that quiet, sunlit room, I had the distinct, impossible-to-ignore feeling that this seemingly ordinary task, helping her with a table, might become the beginning of something I didn't yet have words for. The table was beginning to take shape, but somehow the work felt secondary to the quiet rhythm of being near her. Every movement, every small gesture she made, seemed to linger in the air around me, as if the room itself was paying attention. I had never been someone easily flustered, yet I found myself acutely aware of her presence. Her soft breath as she leaned over to check a board, the faint scrape of her fingers along the wood, the way her eyes met mine just long enough to make me stumble over my next words. She reached for a drill and our hands brushed. Just a fleeting contact, so brief it might have gone unnoticed, but for a moment, a small current seemed to pass between us. My palm tingled where hers had pressed, and I felt a flutter in my chest I hadn't expected. She noticed the subtle reaction, but only gave me a half-smile, a hint of amusement in her eyes, as if sharing a private joke without words. "Careful with that," she said lightly, her voice warm but firm. I nodded, suddenly conscious not only of the drill but of the space between us. There was something magnetic about the way she moved, a casual grace in every motion, like she was perfectly at ease in her own skin. I watched, almost hypnotized, as she adjusted a plank, her fingers tracing the edge with deliberate care, brushing mine once again as she handed it back. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and the subtle perfume she always wore, warm, floral, familiar in a way that made the room feel intimate even though we'd barely touched more than our hands. She laughed at my awkward misalignment of a plank, and it was soft, musical, and surprisingly close. I realized I was holding my breath for a split second, trying to steady the inexplicable thrum of tension I felt whenever she leaned near. At one point, she crouched to tighten a screw, and her shoulder brushed mine. The touch was fleeting but deliberate enough that I felt it linger longer than necessary. My heart picked up pace, a mixture of excitement and hesitation. It wasn't supposed to mean anything yet, and maybe it didn't. But there was an undeniable awareness building between us, a silent acknowledgement that neither of us could fully ignore. Despite the age difference, there was an ease in our interaction that felt natural, like the kind of unspoken connection that only appears when two people notice each other in ways that words can't capture. She seemed to sense my nervous energy and leaned just slightly closer to guide me, her hand brushing my wrist as she corrected my angle. That small touch, a whisper of skin on skin, sent a ripple of warmth through me, grounding me while also making me acutely conscious of her nearness. As we paused to step back and admire the half-built table, I realized the room had grown quieter, filled with a subtle tension that wasn't awkward but electric. Our eyes met again, and I caught her exhaling softly, as if she too felt the shift, the tiny but undeniable closeness that had begun to grow between us. It was in these small touches, these shared movements, that the foundation of something far more profound was quietly forming. An intimacy neither of us had planned, yet both of us were beginning to feel, in every brush of her hand, every fleeting glance, every heartbeat that seemed to echo just a little faster when we were near. By the time we reached the midpoint of the table, the work itself felt almost secondary. The rhythm of our movements had synchronized naturally, and there was an easy playfulness in the air, a teasing energy that seemed to arise from nothing at all. I reached for a screwdriver she was holding, our hands touching briefly as I claimed it, and she gave me that look, the one that lingered just a fraction too long, warm and knowing. "You really are all thumbs sometimes," she said with a teasing smile, her tone light but layered with something softer beneath it. The corners of her eyes crinkled as she laughed, and the sound seemed to wrap around me, warm and intimate. I smiled back, slightly embarrassed but drawn in by her gentle mockery. It wasn't the first time her attention made my pulse quicken, and I felt a self-conscious thrill in the way she watched me, as though noticing every little movement, every small hesitation. Then she crouched down to show me the correct angle for a joint. I leaned in to watch, and instinctively, our knees bumped together. I froze, a little startled by the sudden closeness, but she only chuckled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face, her fingers grazing my arm in the process. The warmth of that touch lingered in a way that seemed to settle around my chest, making it harder to focus on the table and easier to focus on her. The sunlight streaming through the window caught her hair just so, casting a golden halo around her profile. I noticed the small details I hadn't before, the gentle curve of her jawline, the subtle way her lips parted when she spoke, the warmth in her gaze that seemed to reach for something unspoken. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and her perfume, and it felt as though the room itself had shrunk, leaving only the two of us in that quiet, sunlit space. At one point, she leaned over, pointing to a misaligned plank, and her shoulder pressed against mine. The contact was so light, so fleeting, that it should have been inconsequential, but it sent a ripple of heat through me, a reminder of how acutely aware I was of her proximity. I found myself holding my breath slightly, waiting for a signal, any signal, that she might feel the same quiet tension that I did. Her laughter filled the space again, soft and teasing, as she nudged the plank into place. I caught the slight quiver of her fingers as she adjusted it, and my hand brushed hers once more in the process. Neither of us pulled away immediately. Instead, we lingered in that subtle connection, a silent acknowledgement of the intimacy quietly building between us. It was innocent enough on the surface, a lesson in assembly, a shared joke, but beneath it, a current of something more was moving, a gentle electric pulse that neither of us fully named. The playful closeness, the light touches, the lingering glances, all of it threaded together to create a tapestry of anticipation. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that every brush of her hand, every teasing smile, was drawing me closer to something I wasn't yet ready to define but was entirely unable to resist. By the time we stepped back to inspect the table again, I realized the energy between us had shifted. The playful flirtation had unlocked a deeper awareness, a quiet recognition that our connection, subtle, warm, and undeniably electric, was only beginning to bloom. After an hour of working side by side, we finally decided to take a short break. The table stood half-finished in the center of the room, its raw wood catching the afternoon sunlight. She gestured toward a small bench by the window, and I followed her, feeling the slight warmth of the sun against my skin and the quiet hush that had settled between us. It wasn't silence born of awkwardness. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy with thought, a pause that allows small moments to breathe. We sat down, a few inches apart, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from one another, but not so close as to make either of us uncomfortable. I noticed the subtle details, the way her fingers rested on her knees, the soft brush of her hair against her shoulder, and the way her gaze occasionally drifted toward me before returning to the table, as if reluctant to fully meet my eyes. There was an unspoken hesitance in her movements, and I realized that beneath her confident exterior, there was a quiet vulnerability she rarely allowed anyone to see. She spoke softly, almost to herself at first, sharing a memory from years ago, a small, intimate moment of her past that had clearly shaped her in ways she rarely discussed. Her voice was calm, yet it carried a fragile undertone that made me lean in slightly, instinctively wanting to offer comfort. As she spoke, her hand gestured lightly, and I felt the faint brush of her fingers against my wrist. It was a simple, accidental touch, but it carried with it a warmth that settled deep in my chest. I wanted to say something, anything, that might acknowledge the gravity of her words without intruding, without breaking the fragile honesty of the moment. So I simply listened, letting the rhythm of her voice fill the space between us. I felt an unexpected pull, not physical at first, but emotional. A desire to be present, to be someone she could trust, to somehow offer support without overstepping boundaries. She glanced at me then, and for a brief moment, the world outside that sunlit room seemed to vanish. I noticed the subtle flicker in her eyes, the way her lips parted slightly, almost as if inviting me into a deeper understanding, a shared space of quiet intimacy. My own breath caught, a faint awareness of the connection that had been quietly building between us. The air smelled faintly of sawdust, mingling with the delicate floral scent of her perfume, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest that wasn't simply from proximity. It was from the recognition that she was allowing me into a private corner of her world. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was comfortable, charged with unspoken acknowledgement. My hand brushed against hers again, and this time, we let it linger just a second longer, an unspoken affirmation that we were both aware of the growing intimacy. I felt a quiet steadiness, a deepened awareness that what was forming between us was more than mere attraction. In that gentle, sunlit pause, I realized that intimacy didn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes, it came quietly, in small touches, in shared confidences, in the courage to simply be present with someone else. And in that moment, I knew, without needing to say it, that something significant, tender, and utterly unspoken had begun to take root between us. By mid-afternoon, the table was nearly complete. Each plank and joint reflected our combined effort, but somehow, the work had become secondary to the quiet, magnetic pull that had been building between us all day. I had grown accustomed to her presence, the warmth of her movements, the subtle energy that seemed to ripple through the room whenever we leaned close. And yet, nothing could have prepared me for the moment that followed. We were adjusting the tabletop, trying to line it perfectly with the legs. I was kneeling, holding one edge steady, when she stepped beside me, reaching down to correct my alignment. Her hand landed on my shoulder, firm but gentle, and I felt a shiver of awareness run through me. Before I could react, she leaned just slightly, and, almost as if on impulse, pulled me gently onto the table itself. My breath caught, suspended between surprise and something else I couldn't yet name. The table, rough under my knees, suddenly became a charged space. Her hand remained on my shoulder, steadying me, but the warmth of her touch spread, grounding me in a way I had never experienced with anyone before. Her body was close, the scent of her perfume mingling with the subtle, earthy smell of the wood, creating an intoxicating sense of immediacy. For a brief moment our eyes met. There was no need for words. The room seemed to shrink, the sounds of the outside world fading. I was acutely aware of every detail. The tilt of her head as she assessed my position, the soft brush of her hair against her cheek as it fell forward, the faint rise and fall of her breath that mirrored my own. My hands hovered slightly, uncertain whether to steady myself or to simply let the moment exist as it was. Delicate, electric, and utterly unspoken. She shifted slightly to adjust my stance, her knees brushing mine, her fingers grazing my wrist. The contact, accidental or intentional, sent a ripple of warmth through me, making it impossible to ignore the tension that had been quietly building since the moment I first stepped into her sunlit living room. I could feel my pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the thrilling vulnerability of being this close to someone who seemed simultaneously untouchable and achingly near. Despite the intensity of the moment, there was a softness to her actions. She wasn't forceful, just confident and self-assured, aware of the magnetic energy between us yet careful not to overstep. I found myself leaning slightly toward her, drawn in by the subtle intimacy of our proximity, by the way her hand rested lightly on my shoulder, by the quiet steadiness of her gaze. In that suspended moment, I realized that what was happening was more than playful closeness or flirtation. It was the culmination of hours of shared work, laughter, and small touches, an emotional crescendo that left us both exposed, vulnerable, and intensely aware of one another. And yet, the tension wasn't awkward or forced. It was alive, warm, and full of possibility, hovering just at the edge of acknowledgement, daring us to notice what had quietly grown between us. When she finally stepped back, allowing space between us, the electricity remained, lingering in the air like a quiet promise. My hands were still slightly trembling, my chest still racing, and I realized that nothing about that moment would be forgotten. Not the pull, not the warmth, not the way our connection had suddenly become impossible to ignore. The air in the room still hummed from the moment on the table, though neither of us had said a word about it. There was no rush, no need to speak. The quiet understanding between us was enough. I found myself still kneeling near the half-finished table, my hands resting lightly on the wood, feeling the warmth of her presence even after she stepped back a few feet. It was a peculiar sensation, like the space itself held the memory of her closeness, as though the room had absorbed the electricity between us and refused to let it fade. She smiled at me then, small and knowing, with just a hint of softness around her eyes that made my chest tighten. It was a smile that carried no pressure, no expectation, just acknowledgement. For the first time that day, I allowed myself to fully relax, letting the tension I had carried slip away. I realized that the pull I had felt wasn't just about proximity or touch. It was about recognition, about seeing someone completely and being seen in return. She walked slowly toward me, picking up a small wooden mallet. Our fingers brushed briefly as she handed it to me, and this time I didn't flinch. I felt the warmth of her hand linger a moment longer than necessary, and it grounded me, comforting me in a way words could not. It was intimate but not demanding, just a shared connection, a quiet acknowledgement that we were attuned to one another. We continued working, slowly, deliberately, side by side. Each movement was unhurried. Every glance, every accidental touch, carried a subtle intimacy. I noticed the gentle curve of her smile when she caught me watching her, the soft way her shoulder occasionally brushed against mine. My awareness of her presence was no longer a source of nervousness. It was a quiet joy, a thrill tempered by respect and care. At one point, she stepped closer to adjust the angle of a plank, and our hands met lightly. Neither of us withdrew immediately. Instead, we let the contact linger, a small, unspoken conversation of fingertips and warmth. In that brief touch, I felt the culmination of the hours we had spent together. The playful teasing, the shared laughter, the vulnerability we had allowed ourselves to reveal. It was in this quiet connection that I realized intimacy could exist without words, without grand gestures. It could be as simple as being present, fully, for one another. When the table was finally complete, we stood back to admire it. I could see the satisfaction in her eyes, but also something softer, something almost wistful. Our hands brushed once more as we reached for the same edge to lift it slightly, and for a moment we simply held that contact, letting the warmth linger. It was subtle, fleeting, and perfect, a private acknowledgement of what had grown between us. As she finally stepped away to let me leave, she placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Thank you," she said softly, and in that single touch, in the quiet steadiness of her gaze, I felt the unspoken understanding that this day, this connection, and this slow-burn intimacy were far from over. The warmth of her hand lingered even after I stepped out of her sunlit room, leaving me with a sense of calm anticipation, the memory of quiet, gentle closeness that neither of us would forget. The afternoon had softened into early evening, the sunlight filtering through the windows in golden streaks that danced across the newly completed table. The work was done, but neither of us seemed eager to break the quiet spell that had settled between us. The room smelled faintly of sawdust and the subtle floral scent she always carried, a combination that now felt inextricably linked to the warmth I had felt around her all day. We stood side by side, inspecting the table, each of us tracing the lines of the wood with careful hands. Our fingers brushed more than once, and this time, the contact was welcomed rather than accidental. I noticed the way she paused to meet my eyes when our hands overlapped on the edge of the plank, a soft smile playing on her lips. It was a smile that carried gratitude, amusement, and something more tender, something that hinted at the depth of the connection we had quietly nurtured throughout the day. "Looks perfect," I said, my voice low, almost hesitant. She glanced at me, a spark of warmth in her gaze, and I realized that even in a simple statement, there was a subtle exchange of acknowledgement, a shared pride, and perhaps an unspoken recognition of how the day had brought us closer than either of us had anticipated. She stepped slightly closer to examine a minor alignment issue, and I could feel the warmth radiating from her side. Our proximity was natural, unforced, and I found myself leaning in slightly, drawn by the gentle magnetism of her presence. Our hands brushed again, this time lingering just a heartbeat longer, and I felt a quiet thrill at the intimacy in such a simple gesture. There was no need for words. The room itself seemed to hold the memory of every laugh, every small touch, every subtle glance that had built the invisible thread between us. As I prepared to leave, she reached out, resting her hand lightly on my forearm. The touch was brief, delicate, but it sent a warmth up my arm that lingered long after I felt her hand lift. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice soft, almost hesitant, carrying a depth of feeling that words alone could not convey. I returned her smile, sensing the mutual acknowledgement of what had passed between us. A day of work that had become something far more intimate, tender, and meaningful than either of us had expected. We lingered for a few moments, neither of us wanting to break the spell. I noticed her eyes, warm and inviting, holding mine a fraction longer than necessary, and I felt a quiet certainty that this was not an ending, but a beginning. A slow, deliberate unfolding of something neither of us needed to rush, something that had been built as carefully and thoughtfully as the table before us. Finally, I stepped back, giving her the space to move freely, and she nodded, a soft smile still lingering. As I walked toward the door, I felt a subtle, lingering warmth in my chest, a mixture of anticipation, satisfaction, and contentment. The day had been ordinary in appearance, a simple project, but it had become extraordinary in feeling. Even as I closed the door behind me, I knew that the memory of the sunlight, the wood, the small touches, and her quiet, magnetic presence would stay with me. The table had been built, yes, but so had something far more enduring, a connection that was tender, respectful, and undeniably real. And as I walked away, I carried with me the quiet knowledge that this was only the beginning of a story neither of us had fully told, but one we had already begun to live in the soft, subtle intimacy of a shared afternoon. Sparkles, if you felt the slow burn tension and warmth of today's story, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, so you never miss a story where emotions linger and hearts quietly connect. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt a moment where a simple touch changed everything?